I wanted to talk about today, I wanted to put a proposition out or an argument that the United States has been engaged in a experiment of sorts over the last 19 years. And it's not necessarily one that is specific to the United States or specific to this war, but it's an experiment that hopefully we'll be able to unpack today, and you'll see if you actually agree with me or not with this argument. So what I want to begin to get at this argument and what this experiment is that I'd like to talk about is to ask you a question of what are the costs of war? And we can kind of think of that broadly. What are actually the costs that are involved in engaging in war or significant political violence? And to narrow that a bit more, because it's still quite a broad question, a broad issue, is what are the costs involved in what's been called the global war on terror? Now, President Obama had nixed that title for these series of conflicts, but it's still it's really the only title we have for the wars, the conflicts that the United States has engaged in across the world since around October 7th, 2001, and that continue to this day. So I want to put this out to you, and you can kind of, just to have a brief dialogue, is when I say, what are the costs of the global war on terror? And kind of talking about cost in a broad sense, what do you think are some of the costs of this war? I'm putting that out to everybody out there. What do you think of the actual costs? Yeah. People's lives. And I'll get back to that in a second. So actually just a cost in the number of people who've been harmed in some way, who've been killed through war. How much do you think in monetary terms, and don't look it up on your phones because it will make it more interesting, what actually do you think is the monetary cost of these conflicts taken together? Like $1.50? Yeah. 3 trillion. 3 trillion. Does that sound like a good, what? 1 trillion. So kind of going up, we're in the trillion mark, right? 3 trillion, 1 trillion. I think it's lower, higher. Well, it's interesting because it's actually hard to know, because if you actually try to look at the budgets of the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Veterans Affairs, all these different departments, it's very, very difficult. There's no one budget that, interestingly enough, no one budget that actually records all this. There is an institute, the Cost of War Project at Brown University, that has tried to look at what this conflict costs. And if you look here, these are actually the places wherein the United States and different allies have been engaged since 2001. It's a very large, I think it's about 40 different countries across the globe over about a 19-year period. And the cost, at least according to the Cost of War Project, is so far $6.4 trillion. Yes? That is the cost to the United States taxpayer. Yes, eventually. Yes. So this is what the United States is paying for this engagement. About $1 trillion of this is actually estimated costs for treating veterans over the next, I forget if it was next 40 years. And this doesn't include the interest that's going to accrue, which is probably over the next 40 years, is set to amount to $8 trillion, because all of this money is borrowed. The taxes were actually slashed over the last decade. So this is the first war in the United States where it's not being paid for by an increase of taxes, it's all being paid for through borrowing. So this is a very, very large bill that's going to come due in the next 40 years. I'm hopefully going to be far into my senility, so we'll leave it up to you. You also said, who was talking about the lives lost? This again is a tricky one because there's not a whole lot of interest of anybody involved in these wars to actually keep a very close tally on the amount of death that's happening. Again, from the Cost of War Project, they've estimated, sorry, I'm standing in the number, that around 800,000 people have been killed. Now, this is a conservative number of actual people that can be confirmed to have died directly as a cause of combat through these wars. Now, if you start then stepping back and looking at indirect death, including death from disease, infrastructure failure, negligence because states can no longer support people, the Cost of War Project estimates that it's about 4 times that number. There are also around at least 21 million refugees right now in a number of countries, most of which are actually in Syria. So we can start looking at this as both in terms of financial costs, which is sometimes euphemistically called treasure, but also in people's direct lives, a very, very large footprint, if you will, that these series of conflicts have created. Now, what I want to get, as bad as all of this is, I want to get at a different type of cost or consequence of these wars that are a bit more, even more difficult to kind of quantify, a bit more difficult to try to spot. And this is, how does situations like this, where you can kind of throw up these numbers and you can kind of quantify it and get a bit better understanding of the immensity of it, how does something like this then actually transform individuals and societies in ways that are harder to look at, that are harder to spot? And specifically what I want to look at is the consequence that's been called, the last couple of decades has been referred to as moral injury. What does such conflicts, what is the impact that it has on the moral life of individuals? And also then, how does that affect societies and their futures? Now, if you look at this picture, this is by a photographer who's taking pictures of specifically soldiers from the United Kingdom who are going to serve in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he'd take pictures of enlisted men and women before, during, and after their tours of duty. Now, pictures have to be interpreted, right? They're not just given. And so you can look at these in a lot of ways. When I look at this, just when you look at a lot of these pictures, he did this, it's a focus on the eyes, this kind of metaphor of the eye and what they reveal. The photographer arguing there's been a change that you can see in actually the way that the person is seeing and encountering the world. Possibly also, if you have the idea of the eyes as the mirror of the soul, the idea of the gaze is somehow connected to what's going on inside, that maybe there's a change here that is a lot harder to discern and to really put a finger on. To try to get at what this changes, what these transformations are, there has been this attempt over the last many decades, first calling it trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, now this term moral injury, which is trying to get at the way that war, or an engagement of war, can make one feel, not everyone, but can make people feel that because of what they have done, maybe failed to do, what they've seen or witnessed, that somehow they don't feel that they can be a good person anymore, however that good is defined. Or that they can't feel that they can strive toward some image of goodness. If you think of somebody that you really admire, who kind of embodies the type of person that you want to be, that all of a sudden the ability to strive toward that is beyond you. Possibly even that the world itself has changed, is no longer possible, no longer a place that supports such goodness. The world is somehow fallen or revealed as fallen. Maybe you even feel that you've been sold a bill of goods about morality and goodness and right or wrong. And even more so, if we kind of put it in a more succinct way, is you can't be a certain, you can no longer try to be a certain type of person. Or even imagine yourself as worthy or having the right to try to be a good person. So we're going to go a bit more into what I'm meaning here and how this is connected to war. One way to do this is to look at the difference between understandings of moral injury and what's been referred to as trauma, or specifically post-traumatic stress disorder. And post-traumatic stress disorder is the specific clinical definition that therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists use to talk about people who have experienced death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And they come out of that experience with a different set of behaviors regarding the world. Usually, I mean, if you've seen any movies, like we were talking about this earlier in the class today, American Sniper, if you've seen a lot of different war movies, you'll see this. This idea that somebody will have flashbacks, that there's an interruption in the sense of time, where all of a sudden you'll be in a mall, but all of a sudden having a flashback as if you're back in the war zone. Or that you will have what's sometimes referred to as hyperarousal, where you'll be in a situation that does not call for alertness, it does not call for threat response, yet you are acting in a way as if you were in about a war zone. And you can understand how distressing that would be if you're just home with your family and all of a sudden you feel like you're in a war zone. There's also a lot of other aspects that are associated with PTSD, including recklessness, like almost having sometimes we'll refer to as a death wish. And it's usually treated in a lot of different ways involving medication and also talk therapy, and there's a lot of different types of therapies that are involved with this. The idea being that PTSD somehow involves the neurology of the sufferer's brain, and that can be kind of treated in that way. Moral injury, on the other hand, and I should be clear, there's a lot of controversy and discussion still about how these two terms are related. Some people will say, like, PTSD can have moral injury. Moral injury is PTSD. But I'm making a kind of a clearer distinction here just so we can get a bit more at a functioning definition of moral injury going forward. And this more has to do with not so much a sense of like time and your behavior and response and flashbacks. It has more to do with the sense of, like I said, with identity, a perceived transformation of character. And whereas you have in PTSD where somebody can actually be having these threat responses and these flashbacks, but not actually remember much at all about the events that led to or that actually caused the PTSD. And be very fuzzy about the violence that they experienced. Generally with something about moral injury, you remember very clearly, and you formed a very clear evaluation about your role, that you should have done something, or something should not have happened. So there's a bit more of, more of a sense of clarity over what the exact events were. And you might actually not be able to get those events out of your mind, and the judgment that then falls on you. So you have let me come over to this side. So I just want to bring up a couple examples of veterans who have felt that, who kind of put up their words, coming out of the recent wars that comprise the global war on terror, came out feeling that, as one sergeant or platoon leader, Mark Louisel, came out saying that what a lot of people don't talk about is when you go back home from the war, you walk around and you say, I'm a bad person. Now, if you think about that, can you imagine any group or people who seriously think as a part of their identity, we're the bad ones? We're the ones who are we're evil, we're wrong, we're horrible. That's actually a very hard thing for human beings to sustain. And it's actually a question that I have, is why that is. Human beings have a very difficult time, or it's almost impossible to really sustain, this idea that, like, I am bad. I'm the one that's the problem. It kind of deteriorates not only your sense of self, but also your daily function. So this is something that hits very close. It hits character, it hits personality, it hits an area of the self that a lot of people will start talking about soul language, that their soul has been harmed. because that language of the soul or other kind of languages beyond psyche or your mind or anything like that, it kind of gets to this feeling of like who you feel you truly are and your deepest self, to kind of use that language. That there's been a very harm here to the deepest part of you. Now, not everybody comes out of war and feels this way, and I want to be very clear about that. I don't want to paint a picture as if the hundreds of thousands of soldiers that have been involved in these wars all come out feeling that they have moral injury. It's a very subjective thing. People usually identify as having moral injury, so it's very difficult to kind of count. And also, more to the point, there are people, a lot of people come out and feeling that what they have done, what they've participated in these wars, and wars in general, had good reason to do so. It was actually a good cause. They've done something good. This is one example taken from a CNN interview where the soldier's basically saying is, definitely references God, which I love as a religious studies person, but that it has a just cause. There was a dictator there that was killing people. This war relieved people of tyranny, right? Now you can go and critique this, but somebody coming out of the war feeling like that what they had done was good, obviously is not going to, at least initially, have a threat of feeling that they were morally injured. But I do want to point out the fact that for some at least, in a significant number, you can come out of these conflicts feeling not only bad, but even some that you've kind of, and this is a difference also with PTSD, there's been a transformation that has occurred in who you are. This is an example of one veteran who had actually committed suicide, saying that, like, I'm not a good person, I've taken lives. And this is a note from his mother saying that he thought of himself as a murderer. And a murderer, by definition, is not good. So if you come from a background, or most people do, feeling that killing in general is not good, right? Killing is something that bad people do unless there's very specific reasons for it. But if you come out of war and you feel that you actually enjoy killing, what does that make you? And this is one of the things that isn't talked about a lot, but if you talk to veterans, comes out quite a bit, is the enjoyment and the fun of combat. I was talking to a guy who was a Navy SEAL commander for Australia, and he actually commanded some US Navy SEAL units in Afghanistan. This is very elite military training and conduct. And he said that, it was a meeting of academics, none of who had been in war like myself. I have not had combat experience. But he said the thing that people always forget is it is the most exciting time of your life, and everything afterward is going to pale in comparison. General Mattis, who was for a brief time Secretary of Defense under Donald Trump, had actually said war is fun. And even kind of saying that to a lot of people can kind of get distressed or a little disturbed about that. Now, people handle this in different ways, but there are soldiers too who are like, enjoying killing is not what a good person does. So what does that make me? If you have this reorientation of desire, where you go out in the world and you're just desiring something that a good person shouldn't desire, what does that make me? It can kind of upend your understanding of the world and of yourself and make it very difficult day by day to actually get through life. Now, let me just see where I'm going with this. Okay. Now, what I've been doing is so far talking a lot. I've been talking a lot about what happens to veterans and soldiers, and specifically, if you see U.S. or UK, soldiers from the United Kingdom, and that's because moral injury as a term was developed by clinicians, psychologists, and psychiatrists who were treating U.S. soldiers specifically, first of all, veterans from the wars in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, and noting that with all the treatment for PTSD and treatment for mental health issues, there still lingered in a lot of the soldiers they were treating this feeling that some sense of shame, that they felt like they were just bad people. And so this term of moral injury came out of those interactions. But it would be very odd to think that moral injury is only felt by soldiers, like official, trained soldiers within certain armies. What happens when we look at moral injury in this way, which of course, if you're a therapist, you have the individual in front of you, and you're trying to treat their suffering, the person who's right in front of you. So your focus can be a bit more narrowed. So there's important work being done there. But if we kind of step back and look at it in a broader way, what this actually means, it would be very odd if only US and English soldiers were experiencing moral injury out of everybody in a war zone. What about everybody else? Because after all, we were talking before about millions and millions of people involved. Official soldiers are a small percentage of that number. If moral injury is a thing and it's broader than soldiers, how is war then affecting whole populations who might be in situations that is affecting their senses of self, their sense of identity, their sense of a perception, even their sense of imagination? What then happens to a society when you look at war and in that way? So I want to switch gears a little bit, and hopefully you can follow with me, from looking at veterans, as important as that is, to looking at another case. And I'm switching from, still in the same geographic area, still in the same conflict, from soldiers who are engaged in combat to drone warfare. And the reason I'm doing drone warfare is because there has been starting to be some work about the effect of drones and an environment with drones on people on the ground. So I don't have a picture of a drone here. I was looking online, and all the pictures of drones are these kind of marketed pictures where they're flying through and missiles are coming off, and it didn't quite get at the point. But one of the things about drones is that you can't really see them, but you can hear them. And a lot of them have propellers, they have different noises. So in areas of the world like North Africa, also up into Pakistan, you have all of these bases that the United States has, and it's not just in the United States now, it's growing quite a bit. I think it's next 10 years, something like 80,000 military-grade drones are going to be sold. And that's like military grade. You have these areas where there is constant drone usage. These are both largely for surveillance, to track people, to see what they're doing, what they're up to. They're also they're vehicles of assassination. And when the U.S. Army or Air Force or CIA is trying to use drones to track someone and possibly to kill them, a drone operator will spend possibly weeks tracking the person to learn intimately what their movements are, how they live their lives, so they can kind of anticipate what they're going to do. And what that means is there's a lot of drone coverage that people who have nothing to do with the wars are experiencing in these war-zoned areas. What that results in is kind of a change in both your perception and the environment around you, of course. So this is a quote from David, I think his name is pronounced Rode, who was a journalist held by the Taliban in 2008. So he was held by the Taliban, I believe, on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, very mountainous area. And he was talking about the drones being terrifying, not because of of the attacks that were happening, but because of the anticipation. They were always there hovering. You could always hear them, but you didn't know where they were, and you didn't know when they would strike. That is an amazing formula for incredible stress and to transform the world around you from a normal, everyday place to one that is just filled with threat. And this is actually in Pakistan a map of kind of tracking, quote-unquote, terrorist attacks with drone strikes. And Nasser Hussain, who has actually passed away, talked about it in terms of trauma, and that this creates societies that have a large amount of trauma because they're constantly under threat. And that's going to make people not just have flashbacks, but be hyperarousal. They won't quite know how to react in an appropriate way in different situations when everything is always up here on a high threat level. But also, if you think about this as possible moral injury, so think about if your family or a parent, and you have children in this region, how can you do what you're supposed to do as a parent, which is protect your children and make sure they're raised into happy, full-functioning adults, contributing members of your community, when the skies above you are now a threat and you're worried about letting your children outside, or even not even letting them outside, but that you feel that any moment an attack could come to your own house? How do you feel then as a parent about the duties and the care that you can no longer give? It can start wearing away about your sense of self as being a failure as a parent, a failure as a community member. And think also about the children whose imaginations might be changed too. Instead of, we were talking tonight at dinner about Nebraska and the big skies, right? And how wonderful and glorious that is. Well, think about it as if you turn that around and you look at a sky, it's no longer a metaphor for openness, for freedom, for possibility. It's just one of constant threat, of terror. That's accompanied by this buzzing sound. It kind of speaks to you in a way. How does that then start to transform the way people see each other, possibly even the future, and their expectations about life and even in the future? And this is important because in these situations, especially when we start talking about peace building, right? Once these wars are done, whenever that might happen, there's always the important thing of peace building. How do you get countries to rebuild, to form a society that's functioning, for forming a society that hopefully will manage its internal conflict in a good way? Well, if you have a society that's been scarred in this way, that has such moral injuries, how does it affect their ability to imagine different futures? How does it affect your ability to imagine who can be or might be, you can't imagine, can be a neighbor? What countries you feel like you can live with and who's a threat? So this can actually have long-term effects on one society, but also peace-building efforts. Are such conflicts, do they have these seeds on a very moral, very personal, even soul level, creating the obstacles to peace that everybody wants in the end? And then you can also not just think about these other countries, but also think about the United States. We were talking about this in the class that I was at this morning. There are 20 million US veterans. For the first time in history, the largest percentage of that are no longer veterans from World War II or the Korean War or even the Vietnam War. It's now from the Gulf Wars. Those that were fought in the early 1990s, the ones that have been fought since 2001. What happens to also the society that is doing the fighting and not just to the veterans, if you have 20 million veterans, but then also to their families and their neighbors. All of a sudden, you get a very large percentage of the society that has been affected by war in some way, right? How does that then start to affect the larger society and what people can actually imagine is possible? And this is important too, because of, again, the numbers we're dealing with. This is a global conflict, and I'm picked global war on terror because, one, it's relevant, it's happening, it's connected to the United States, but also just because of the scale and the people that are involved. As I said before, it's not just the people that were killed, but 21 million, at least 21 million people are either refugees, meaning they had to leave the country, and they're now stateless, and they are living at the behest of a foreign country in camps, or internally displaced people where they're still in their home country, but they have nowhere to go. They cannot return home. So like internal refugees. This is especially prominent if you look at Syria right now. When you look that about 12 million people are refugees in Syria out of a population of 18 million. This is huge because that then affects, the Middle East is, of course, a very stable region. And so you have a country in the middle of the Middle East that is basically torn apart. How does this affect not just Syria, but also the countries all around it? And this is not just, like, again, we can look at this in terms of, money and infrastructure, of foreign relations, all of which are very, very, very important. But how are the generations that are involved in this and the generations that are coming up after this, how is what they look at and how they live, how is this going to affect and change the culture? And you can see this, I think this is a picture taken in Aleppo, which is a beautiful old city in Syria, part of the Silk Route to China, a very ancient city. This is a picture of a wonderful promenade, and this is how the promenade looks today. That's a very different place to grow up in than this. And the images that are available to you are going to be very different in that situation than in this situation. It's also going to be different from somebody who grew up in that situation and now in this situation as well. The images that are available to you and how you interpret them and understand them form how you imagine, right? That word image is central to imagination, how you perceive things, how you evaluate things. And the thing is, what's really difficult is, one, we don't fully know how this affects people individually. We're still trying to get our, a handle on just trauma and PTSD, which is a term that's from the 1970s. Moral injury is even more squishy because it deals with things like character, personality, morality. It's hard to know how people are affected, but then when you look at a larger view, we know very, very little about how this then actually affects societies, their futures, and the promise of peace building itself, of how people can actually get along after that. And there's this quote by Carolyn Nordstrom, who's a retired anthropologist from the University of Notre Dame, who wrote a chapter in a book talking about the tomorrow of violence, talking about how violence becomes a determining factor in shaping reality as people will know it in the future. And she's a bit vague about this, but she also talks about the fact of violence shapes the future. It shapes the tomorrow. And if you think about, she's looking at this rather broadly. If you think about wars, but if you also think about, more domestic forms of violence, how human life is shaped intimately by experiences with violence. When you look at this then specifically at the moral, you can zoom in like I've done today with this idea of moral injury to look at about the way that affects, not so much affects character, but the way you feel your character is affected and who you are. You have a situation where war is almost like a moral laboratory. When you engage in war, you are engaging in an experiment. Of course, in the future, but also an experiment in identity and people's moral lives themselves. What certain possibilities are open, what possibilities of being a certain person are foreclosed upon. And these are always experiments. War, looking at it as a moral laboratory, these experiments are never under control, right? If you look at the way that national leaders talk about war, they will talk about what the goals are and what they hope to achieve, right? In the class earlier today, we're talking about, spreading democracy, spreading certain virtues, transforming the world that one free of tyranny, where people are more free, they have more choice, right? These are the goals. And you can talk about that as a way that it's almost like these are the goals for this understanding of war as a moral laboratory, to transform areas of the world where different ways of life are possible, and maybe certain ways of life that you think of as negative are less likely. When the fact of the matter is, it's always a huge gamble, because who can really have control over such experiments? So one of the things that just my research looking into just moral injury, and to be a bit more fancy, the way violence affects moral subjectivity, basically who you are as a moral person, being, has kind of led me more and more to think about events that are happening around the world, especially now as we're in this era that's called the Anthropocene, this era of incredible human influence over the environment, human beings collectively as a transformative force in the planet, and as conflicts are going to only escalate as resources drop, more refugees are created, as some places become very difficult to live in, as regimes and countries become destabilized, that we're possibly also not just with individual wars, but we're also possibly entering a time period of incredible experimentation with human societies, cultures, and what we think of as good lives, what lives worth living, what lives are possible, what lives are not possible. Now, I know that's not an incredibly hopeful note, and I'm an academic. We can become very, very negative, and you look at all the problems, and then when you're just like, what are the solutions? And it's like, well, that's for practical people. But it does kind of just set it's trying to set these things that we think of like as war. We all know what war is. We all know what these things are. To try to turn it around and look at, we actually don't know what it is at all. We have a very thin grasp of what these things are. And usually where you find information about how war acts like this, you usually find it in literature, novels. The guy Jonathan Shea, who coined the term moral injury, he didn't write a psychological article are there any psychology majors out there? Oh, good, then we can totally just bad talk psychology, great. I was kind of nervous there'd be a psychologist here and he'd be like, you're all wrong. But since they're not, yay. But he didn't go and try to write like a scientific psychological article. He actually thought that you could see moral injury in Homer's Iliad. And it actually would be better for veterans if they could read historical literature, and see themselves in it. And you'll see actually some veterans, they have these theatrical troupes, and they will go and perform Greek tragedy. So kind of veterans becoming actors to kind of perform this and then having discussion with people about this. And you can see this too, in different religious practices. I didn't really get to this here, but a lot of people who try to engage this moral injury that they have, we were talking about this at dinner tonight, some of them actually go on what you could call pilgrimage. How much time do I have? I want to make sure. I think I'm about time. Actually, I want to see if do I have any? Nah, I don't have those pictures, sorry. But they'll go on things that, if you're a religious studies scholar, you'll be like, oh, you're going on pilgrimage. There's the first person ever recorded to have completed the Appalachian Trail was a World War II veteran whose friend from Pennsylvania died in Iwo Jima, and they'd always planned to go and do this hike, but his friend had died, so he went and he did the walk himself. And more recently, just in the last 5 or 10 years, there have been groups of veterans who have tried to retrace that and go on this walk themselves. Somebody from religious studies, I'm like, oh, that's pilgrimage. They're participating in something very human. And there's a lot of resources there for understanding that. So there's a lot of ways to engage this that can draw on the arts, can draw on religious traditions, that can draw on literature, that can help people, since these are very imaginative ways of engaging with the world, can try to engage with one's own imagination, and so also with their ethical problems that they're experiencing as well. So I didn't want to leave this, I study moral injury and genocide and war, so I can be a bit of a downer at dinner parties. But I didn't want to leave this as something that's hopeless. It is something I think that's very intimate to what it is to be human, and that we don't really necessarily have great ways of talking about it or even engaging it and trying to understand that. But if we do look at people who survive such violence and how they respond in their lives, and we can talk about this more if you like, you can actually see that they are very creatively trying to find ways of dealing with it so that they can go from a situation to here to try to find a situation where if they can't quite return to this image, they can at least try forging a new image out of this that maybe will be a bit more hopeful and a place for future peace.